Good evening. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. This is our first faculty pub night of the semester with Dr. Rebecca Sager. My name is Jamie Hazlett, and I'm the outreach librarian here at Hannon Library. I just want to do a couple of things of housekeeping before I introduce Dr. Sager. You'll see these little pieces of paper that you may have sat on. If you wouldn't mind, please filling these out. This helps us. One of the things that we hear at a lot of our library events is, well, it would have been nice if I had heard about this ahead of time, or I would go to more of these if I knew that you were doing this. So this helps us learn how you heard about this. If you have any suggestions for how we can improve these things, this is very useful for me. So you can leave it under your chair, on your chair at the end of the event, and we'll collect them. I also want to point out that we have an e-newsletter that we send out monthly that has information about upcoming library exhibits, programs and events, and other collection news, that sort of thing. We've got a sign-up sheet back there. And we also have, this is what we have going on this semester. So we've got these handouts in the back as well. There is one event that I want to give a plug for that is not on any of these calendars because we just booked him, but on October 2nd, author Hector Tobar, who's the author of Barbarian Nurseries, is going to be coming and speaking and doing a book signing as well. So if you want information about that, we're very excited to be hosting him. But I'm going to talk about our special guest tonight now. So Rebecca Sager is currently an assistant professor of sociology. She has her PhD and her MA from the University of Arizona, and she completed her undergraduate studies at UC San Diego. She's been at LMU since 2007. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right, so her research focuses, and the reason that you are here tonight is on the relationship between religion and public life, with a focus on how religion impacts policy and politics, religion's role in social movements, and the sociology of religion. She's published on state-level faith-based practices with work featured in the peer-reviewed journals, including Journal of Church and State, the Black Music Research Journal, and the Sociology of Religion, amongst others. We've got another pretty long list of some other major accomplishments, including an NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant that she received in 2008, and she was awarded one of 2 visiting prestigious fellowships at Princeton University Center for the Study of Religion in 2009. So I think I will let Rebecca take it from here.
Hello. So it's just like class where the first row is the last to fill up, right? Okay. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about my book, Faith, Politics, and Power, Politics of Faith-Based Initiatives. And I wanted to sort of start by telling you a story. So I know many of you recognize this man up here, right? Okay, I know he's been a little absent from current political discourse, so maybe I haven't seen him for a few years. But the Faith-Based Initiative really got its start under George Bush. And it actually got its start when George Bush was governor of Texas. And how he introduced the initiative, I think, tells an important story about the initiative, which in 1996, before it was actually signed into federal law as part of the Welfare Reform Bill, he brought together a number of faith and community activists to the Alamo. And he introduced his version of the faith-based initiative and really described it as sort of the initiative that was going to win the war against secular activists which were attacking our national government, right? And so at this time, he was really part of this growing group of conservative evangelical actors that had gained increasing power and prominence within the Republican Party, and I would argue are even more powerful today, have really reshaped the ideas, values, policies that are acted upon within the Republican Party. But this is back in 1996, and really when their influence was starting to be felt. And so he had a rally at the Alamo because he felt that government was infringing on the rights of religious groups and that he had to take a stand to change this. And what better place than for him as being governor of Texas than the Alamo, right? So this was where to take your stand to fight back. So at the Alamo, Bush promised to create a revolution in social services and make the faith-based initiative the sort of cornerstone of his compassionate, conservative agenda. And it actually was the first major piece of legislation he introduced as president in early 2001, but it was soon eclipsed by, of course, September 11th. However, at this time, this was really what he was going to build his legacy on, both as governor, and he had already started thinking about running for president at the time. So, as governor, he really aggressively pursued the faith-based initiative, eliminating licensing requirements for faith-based organizations, including child care services, creating new bureaucratic positions, specifically 11 new offices of faith-based initiatives throughout Texas, and essentially just trying to bring religious organizations closer with government and state actors, and facilitating a new legal culture where the common understanding of church-state separation would be replaced by church-state cooperation. So I just want to give a little brief history of the initiative. So underlying the faith-based initiative was the belief of supporters like George Bush and then Senator John Ashcroft, who actually wrote the original federal faith-based legislation into law at the very last minute. So it was a writer onto the original welfare reform bill in 1996, and he added it at the very last minute without anyone even being able to vote on it. And Clinton actually wrote a signing statement saying that as president, he would not actively implement any part of this initiative. But they really felt that religious organizations that offered inherently religious services, or that were, not just faith-based, but were actively religious organizations where faith was part of the service, were better at providing social services than other organizations, and that they had been unfairly discriminated against and prejudiced in federal funding decisions. And they felt that these groups really needed to become a bigger part of state-sponsored, federal-sponsored social services. And they argued that by removing barriers such as requiring faith-based groups to have a separate nonprofit organization through which to funnel all their money would mean that all these churches, or what John Ashcroft described as the armies of compassion, would arrive and essentially take over for the government, because the government wouldn't be needed anymore, that these churches would become the center of our social service program. After this initial implementation in Texas, some states and the federal government followed a similar pattern, creating state and federal faith-based offices and additional policies of their own design. Of course, what's so interesting about all of this is that every single state had already contracted with faith-based organizations and have been doing so often for years, if not decades. So Lutheran Social Services, Catholic Charities, Salvation Army, already all had federal and state government contracts. So the question then became, why are states then pursuing this, possibly very costly policy if they're already doing this work already? What are the other potential motives that are out there? And I argue that the answer lies not so much in the desire to fundamentally alter the social service sector, as some proponents had stated, but rather that the faith-based initiative and its policies and practices at the state level are the result of something else entirely. So, to help solve this problem, I draw on and add to several areas in social science research, including work in social policy, sociology of religion, and political science. First, because the faith-based initiative has its historical roots in the resurgent evangelical movement, it helps enlarge our understanding of the role of religion in social movements and in creating policy. Second, when looking at what happens once policy is actually created, it informs our understanding of the nature of policy making and why policies can be critical tools of political power. Finally, I really feel like this work bridges the gap between social movements and policy literatures, looking at how movements, through insider political access, so essentially there's this whole kind of idea in the social movements literature that to be a social movement, you have to be this kind of modeled after 1960s protest movement out in the street, not part of the government, totally disenfranchised. My work on the evangelical movement with the faith-based initiative and other avenues of laws show that this movement has really become part and parcel of institutional politics. You cannot separate insider political actors within large chunks of the Republican Party, especially in states like Texas, from evangelical social movement activists. And it's sort of naive to think that the only way social movements happen is through protest and disenfranchised people. So I argue that understanding this faith-based policy really helps us understand how we can change our norms around church and state, right? So we have gone through this about 20-year process of changing what church and state looks like. And with the faith-based initiative, there was this social construction of a social service crisis that wasn't really happening, and which the only answer was an infusion of religion and a changing of how we understand church-state relationships. So the faith-based initiative, when looked at as this sort of symbolic political tool, is both creating or catering to the ideological concerns of the evangelical movement and acting as a political tool to reach out to new groups to try to increase the political base for support. So I'd like to note here that this presentation is really part of a much broader body of work where I'm looking at specifically the intersection between religion and institutional politics. So I have studied the conservative evangelical movement for quite some time, and I have also been over the last 5 years looking at progressive religious activism and its ties within the Democratic Party, and including working on a couple of campaigns over the last 4 years doing field research. So if you have any questions about any of that, I'd also be glad to talk about that at the end of the project too, or presentation too. So for this project, I gathered comprehensive data on the faith-based initiative at the state level. What were states doing? Why were they doing it, right? Looking at every single state from 1996 to 2006, and I've actually done some updating on that up to 2009, which isn't just the quantitative pieces, not the qualitative pieces, but again, would be glad to talk about that also. So the two main research questions I was focusing on, so how were states implementing this faith-based initiative, which was pretty undefined. People were just sort of going about it, making it up as they went along. They had a little bit of guideline from what Texas had done, some other states, but no one knew exactly how you were supposed to do this. And then the second question, okay, so no one knows how you're supposed to do this. We're already doing a lot of this work, but a lot of things were happening at the state level, so why were states doing this in the first place? Okay, so what I found was that the most common way for states to implement faith-based initiatives was by creating a state faith-based liaison. So by 2005, 33 states had created this official position of state faith-based liaison. It was a government-paid worker that was supposed to reach out to faith-based organizations and churches, some of which were already doing social services, some of which weren't. Since 2005, there's been an additional 4 states that have created these offices or liaison positions. And so these people were the primary way that faith-based initiatives were enacted at the state level. So they, were in a government office, usually at the state capitol, sometimes, not always though, and they were told, okay, you're supposed to now go out and find a way to get religious groups to start doing more social services. We're not really sure how you're supposed to do that. We're not giving you any instructions, but that's what you need to start doing. And so these 33 people started doing that. They were like, all right. And here, this is this is an updated map. These are all the states that have or had at one point faith-based liaison. California actually doesn't have one anymore, but we briefly had one under Schwarzenegger. But what's interesting is in Los Angeles, for example, almost every city agency has someone that is a designated faith-based liaison. So just because it's not necessarily happening at your state level doesn't mean that there isn't someone who is dedicated to doing religious outreach throughout a number of government branches. And Harvard did a study, and it was well over 300 mayoral offices actually had their own city faith-based liaison also. So what I did was I traveled around for a few years, and I went to almost every state that had a state faith-based liaison and did interviews with them in person, and then when I could, also went to state faith-based conference. I ended up interviewing a total of 30 of the 33 liaisons that were active at the time. I did a number of other interviews with White House officials and former liaisons, city liaisons, and other organizations that they were working with. And I talked to them from anywhere from 40 minutes to 2.5 or 3 hours. And I often saw them, so I started this in 2002. I didn't really finish the research till 2005, and I would see them usually many times over this 3-year period. And but for the formal interviews, I asked them a series of questions. You know, do you have a website? Do you have a budget? Are you full-time? Are you part-time? Why did you take this job? What's your religious background? What do you see as the purpose kind of this initiative? And what I found was something I think pretty interesting, which is, first of all, maybe not surprisingly, these were very religious people. So almost all of them, instead of just being kind of government bureaucratic appointees, they heard about the faith-based initiative. Most states implemented after Bush came to the presidency, and they heard about it and were really excited and asked to be appointed as the faith-based liaison. They said, please, this is something I really want to have as part of my office. This is something I want to do. So 9 out of the 30 were pastors, 4 held formal positions at their congregations, 5 were informal positions, and almost all of them had worked extensively with faith-based groups. So these were people who were really religiously active and connected with their religious communities. So they were people who wanted to do a good job, right? These weren't people who were just kind of looking at their job as this job as something extra. They were really wanting it to succeed. They really believed that this was something that was going to be supported, that the president believed in, that their state believed in, and that they were going to see money for it. So before we start, so this is kind of some of their explanations for why they took the position. So one said, we didn't get this faith component by default. It came to my office because I wanted it. Others described it like a calling, right? Like if you ever, I don't know if any of you ever talked to ministers, but they almost always describe it as not, I wanted this job, but that I was called to this, that this wasn't something I sought out, but this was something that I had to do. So I felt the call, I really did. I felt like this was the opportunity to make the difference. And as another said, I was at a place in my personal journey of faith where I realized that community was important, not just to me, but to God. And I felt that was indeed, a calling to get involved. So they were really excited. So they were, this was brand new. George Bush had actually promised several $1 billion in new aid to faith-based groups. And they were like, this is going to be great. We're going to really be able to help people. So what actually happened? Well, what actually happened was very different than what they thought was going to happen. So there were 4 main ways that states went about implementing the initiative, but overall, it was a lot of political bang, right? So states could say, we have this faith-based office, we love religious groups, vote for us, right? If you're the governor or if you're a congressman or something. But almost none of them actually put any real money into the initiative. In fact, of the approximately $2 billion that Bush promised, only about $400 million over his entire 8 years ever went to the faith-based initiative. So direct funding to faith-based groups, only 4 states at this time really offer direct funding to organizations to actually do any work. So 4 of these 43 offered money to groups to actually have them do social services. Pretty small. Intermediary organizations, so some created these sort of relationships between faith-based groups and state organizations in order to help facilitate partnerships. What's interesting about that, this really only happened in 2 states, and in some ways it's really kind of a nonprofit model of organization, right? We're going to be a state group that's going to help facilitate this nonprofit group to do services better. What they found out was that this was much more challenging than they had originally suspected. So in one state, Oklahoma, which was the original creator of this intermediary idea, one of the 3 intermediate organizations that they started in, I think it was 2003 or 4, folded within 6 months. Because so they had started this Adopt a Social Worker program where the state worked with churches to help them meet the needs of social workers that weren't being met by state offices. And what they found was that the needs of the social workers and the families they were supposed to be helping were much greater than anything they had ever suspected, and that, they just couldn't, this nice upper middle class churches in Oklahoma City could not understand and meet the needs of very poor, consistently in the system people that needed, trained service and help, and it folded within 6 months. The third way, which was more common, were conferences in order to help kind of create relationships between these groups. And finally, there was networking. So what the liaisons, because they had almost no money, what they ended up doing was making a lot of phone calls and sending a lot of emails, right? So they were kind of on their own without having any real resources, and were trying to help these groups, but instead just kind of became these information machines. So they would point them where to go for resources, but didn't have any of their own. One of the women that I kind of consistently ran into over this time period, and she just kept coming up to me and saying, "Where's the money? Where's the money?" And I was like, it's like Jerry Maguire. And I was like, I have no answer for you. There is no money, actually. There is no money out there. And she had been doing the work since 2002 and finally started to realize, the last time I saw her was 2005, there was no money out there. That she had been working and putting her heart and soul into this initiative without anyone really there to help her out. So taken together, these activities clearly do not show a pattern of consistent assistance for religious organizations through the faith-based initiative. And these were the 3 main problems that liaisons ran into. So there was no guidance and infrastructure for how to implement the initiative in the first place, lack of resources, a lack of capacity from the faith-based organizations. So something that the liaisons didn't recognize at first was that most churches don't have the capacity to run very large federal grants. That they are just, half of all churches have 75 members or less. Most churches have a part-time pastor. They do not have the capacity to have an auditor, to have someone who's managing their books for them. In fact, one of the women that I talked to, she said that they ran a whole training program to receive on grant writing. So they're in this whole grant writing program, and at the end, the end product was supposed to be that these faith-based organizations would write a mini grant, and then they would receive $5,000 that would then help them get more money to do more work. And of the 21 participating faith-based organizations, only 14 actually did this mini grant application. And she said, I was like, this money was really given away. The application was no more than 2 pages, and really it was just a test to see if they could do it by a due date. They couldn't even do that. So not only were the liaisons running up against no real assistance from state and federal governments, no real money coming in, but they were also running up against this problem where churches were keeping, one guy talked to me about, this church that really did actually want to do something, but they kept their account books in a notebook under their mattress. And he was like, you can't get a federal or state grant with accounting practices like that. It's just not going to happen. And finally, there was this problem of longevity. Where is this office going to end up? What's going to happen when George Bush isn't president? What's going to happen when the governor isn't around anymore? So if the states were not really given assistance, if this implementation was so haphazard, if there wasn't really the money around, why were states doing this then? If this wasn't really about trying to create extra services for people in need, what was actually driving the initiative and implementation across states? And there are kind of 2 main arguments in literature. One is that states that needed real assistance in helping people in need were more likely to implement it. They had a porous welfare safety net and saw this as a way to get more money. And the other is that there were political motivations surrounding this initiative that had nothing to do with actually trying to get more assistance to people. So in my interviews, I talked to the liaisons about this, and about half of them said, yeah, this is really about trying to get more money. We're really just trying to fill these gaps in the social safety net, and we're hoping that by creating an office, creating a liaison position, doing these conferences, sort of showing the federal government that we're supportive, that we're going to get some fiscal return back. But the other half said, well, yeah, that's part of it, but there's something else, even for us, happening here. And what I found when I looked at the data is that states with the strongest evangelical influence on state Republican parties, so states where the conservative evangelical movement had taken over key aspects of the Republican Party platform, actors within the party, were 2.5 times more likely to create a liaison position and 11 times more likely to create an office. So that this was really not just about filling the gap in the social safety net, but this was about a social movement push to change what social policy looks like and reformulate the relationship between church and state. And so when I talked to the liaisons, they echoed many of these sentiments. And as one told me, I think there was a growing debate about whether separation of church and state was in fact being articulated by the press and national organizations correctly. So I think there were many in the church community who are already sensing that they were being displaced from the public square and were looking for a reason to reclaim their presence in the public square. To some degree, I think, are coming along and affirming the role of faith community being from the government the faith community saw it as very important. When, or as another said, when President George W. Bush came out talking about social policy and faith-based initiatives, it resonated with a lot of us because we saw it working on the ground, and that there could be more fruitful collaborations between government and faith groups, and that it was just government was behind the times. So that there was this real sense that there needed to be a re-articulation, a reformulation of this relationship between church and state, and these liaisons and offices were fundamental to that happening. So in the beginning, I argued that we had to go back to the beginning, thinking about that George Bush story of the Alamo, right, to really understand and fully explain faith-based initiatives. So since 1996, supporters had argued that there would be a revolution in the social service sector, and we would see this real transformation of who was doing services. However, this was clearly not the result of what was actually happening. Mark Chavez and Bob Weinberg did a study looking at congregation involvement in social services and found that there was no increase in the number of congregations receiving government grants in this entire time period. So nothing changed. The only, as far as numbers of churches actually doing this kind of work, the only thing that had changed is that the few churches that were doing a lot of this work were getting some more money. So the churches that had been doing the work were just becoming more successful, but it wasn't reaching out to new people, broadening the service net to new organizations. And instead, this is really about creating a new and different and potentially closer type of relationship between religion and government, which was a long goal of conservative, especially evangelical actors, that the articulation of church-state separation was fundamentally wrong, and that the faith-based initiative, through instituting religiously based public offices, was part of the symbolic legacy of being able to erode that boundary. So I think it's really important to examine the faith-based initiative not on its own, but as part of a long and very complicated series of policies and political initiatives that are reshaping what church-state relationships look like at the state and federal level, from faith-based initiatives to state Republican parties to compositions of school boards to policy success in a number of different areas, from education, religious monuments, funding of faith-based, birth control, right? All different kinds of state-level policies that have become much more conservative and religious-oriented over time. So these are really significant cultural changes in our understandings of what church and state look like, and the faith-based initiative is part of those changes. So one of my last interviews that I did, the faith-based liaison, who was a minister, and he said, I know there's lots of problems, I know there's lots of things that are going wrong, but let's not throw the baby out with the baptismal water, right? Okay, there are still some things that can be resurrected from this initiative. And I think it's important to look at this data and see what can work, what does work, and build on the initiative from that, rather than focusing on this as a symbolic political effort that's really just about creating political power for people and not really about changing people's lives. So I just want to leave with a quote from Sister Simone, who some of you, Sister Simone Campbell, some of you may know, and she said, we've been paying too much attention lately to politics that are disguised as morality. And we should really be paying attention to how to build a better world for all of us and our community, and not to the political dimensions of things like how can we use something, leverage something like the faith-based initiative for power. Okay. So, thank you.
So we've got plenty of time for questions.
Yeah. Of the churches that accepted the faith-based monies, how many of those lost their tax-exempt status?
This is so none of them. So this is actually, that's a big part of the discussion is, well, churches have always been doing social services, always been receiving money, state money to do social services. The really fundamental change the faith-based initiative allowed for was that churches no longer had to have a separate 501c3 unless it was part of state law. Now, there are some states that actually did implement legislation saying you have to have a separate 501c3 in order to receive government money. Because we have to know that your money isn't going to your pastor, isn't going to build a new church, but that it's going for you to actually do the social service. But some states don't have that money.
Was California one of those?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can find out.
Okay. Well, I believe they were. The church that I'm involved with, that was one of the main problems and our main concerns, that in accepting the funds, the grants,
Yeah.
the 501c3 would then be basically thrown out with the baptismal water.
Right, and that was a big concern for churches, is that they didn't want to, if you take government money, then there will be scrutiny on what you're doing.
And then
right?
the taxes would be used to fund the other faith-based initiatives.
Right, well, you had no control over what other churches were doing. So, yeah, I mean, churches were very concerned about that, and it is a reasonable concern. And it's, a lot of churches spend their time ministering to their flock, spend their time taking care of the parishioners that they have, and they just, they like the idea of being able to do something else, but there's a lot of strings that are attached to that money. One of the things that both Obama and Bush did eliminate, one of the strings that many people are still concerned about, is that religious groups that take federal funds can discriminate on the basis of religion when hiring. Right. So what that means is that even if you're a church and you're getting a federal grant to run a daycare and you're Baptist, even if you're taking federal money to do that, you can say, I'm only hiring Baptists, I'm not hiring Jews or Catholics, even though I'm getting the federal grant to do that. And Obama actually originally, when he was running for office in 2008, said he would eliminate that, but since he was elected, he decided that it was, I don't know what he decided, but he hasn't done that. So, but my thought is that, there's more, it would be more of a political problem to eliminate that than it is to keep it, right? Everyone who's concerned about religious discrimination and hiring practices is already going to vote for Obama, and then he would get a lot of political flack for undoing that provision. And he's also kept the faith-based office at the White House. He's just renamed it the White House Office of Faith and Community Partnerships.
So when these offices were originally created, was there any language or any expectation that these were going to be interfaith offices, or were they all, in your research, were they all Christian organizations?
There were a few states that were concerned about that were very interested in making it interfaith. There's sort of a weird outlier of New Jersey. So New Jersey was one of the first states to implement a faith-based office. It was also one of the only ones to really fully fund the office to the tune of around $3 million every year for the last 15 or so years. And they were very concerned about making sure that it was interfaith. Most of them were not. I don't know if, but no one said, like, we don't want it to be interfaith, but no one said, we're really concerned to make sure that it is interfaith, right? Yeah.
I would just be curious to see if these faith-based organizations changed voting or anything really at all, because they didn't get any money.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't do anything. And you said they were used to change voting behavior, but if no one knows about them.
Well, what would happen, so the biggest sort of way that they would make a splash was through these conferences. So they would hold these giant statewide conferences, and usually most of these were held around 2004 in swing states. And so David Quo, who actually worked for the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, talked about in a book that he wrote how the states were picked based on whether or not they were swing states, and then they would have a Republican congressman, senator, governor sponsor the activity, and then largely invite African American religious voters to do, this isn't strange, but to do what most political parties do, which is try and chip away a little bit at the other side. So if we can get a few thousand more, 1-2 percentage switch in the African American vote in some of these swing states, because we've had this faith-based initiative, because we've shown our support for African American congregations, which are significantly much more likely to partner with government organizations to do this kind of work in the first place, then we can leverage this in a political way. And also, we can show our bona fides to the evangelical movement and rally the base around this initiative. So it was really kind of a twofold political advantage. We can get evangelical voters out, and we can chip a tiny bit away at the other side's voting bloc.
Yeah. One question that I have is about sort of the creation of this problem. As you said, it's not like really a problem, but it is in people's minds.
Right.
So have you looked much at getting this to be an issue in people's minds? This, our faith is under attack sort of mentality.
Right. So one of George Bush's key advisors when he was governor of Texas is Marvin Olasky, who's a pretty well-known evangelical author and activist. And he was advising George Bush at the time and was like, we really need to make a change here. These are organizations, they aren't getting the funds that they need because they have all these restrictions. They have to hire co-religionists. They have to meet the same standards as a secular group, but they are serving a higher, better mission. So this all happened the organization was a group called Teen Challenge, which was a faith-based organization in Texas, and they were being sued for not meeting sort of basic social service requirements. And that's what brought George Bush the Alamo. He said organizations like Teen Challenge don't have to meet these requirements because they're meeting the requirements of a higher power. So he was, working with Marvin Lasky, Chuck Colson, all these other organizations, and the idea was that these groups are special, right? They're set apart. They offer something better and different and more than secular service organizations do, and so therefore they can be exempt from the regular practices of other social service agencies. And they really did see it. I mean, I don't know, what's happening now, but they really did see it as a siege. And Marvin Olasky said in one of his, in Renewing American Compassion, he said the federal government's gradual entrenchment in America's public sector has created an increasingly inhospitable environment for charities' religious elements. So they saw the secular government sector as inherently anti-church-based social service programs. Now, what's totally fascinating is that so under Bush, they limited licensing requirements for things like church-based daycares, things like that. They actually, I think it was 2001 or 2, reinstated the requirements because they had so many problems and were being sued so often because faith-based groups were breaking just sort of standards of practices. And so the Republican governor and Republican Congress and Senate in Texas reinstated the licensing requirements because it had turned out to be such a problem. So, more questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if there was a state, and maybe it's New Jersey, that you felt was sort of a model, like that they sort of made the best of it, and they sort of used the program as best they could.
Yeah, I mean, New Jersey was definitely one. I mean, they really tried to do what they could. They did, actually Oklahoma was one that also, with these kind of few limited resources, tried to do as much as they could with what they had. And I think part of the problem is that these everyone just sort of went in with the assumption that all these groups were going to, A, want to do this work, and B, were going to be ready to do this work. And over time, everyone found out that neither of those things were necessarily true, that there were some groups who wanted to do this work, and there were some groups that were ready to do this work, but they needed to do a lot more research into who that was actually going to be. And most of these offices are still actually active, and what's interesting over time is that, I mean, any of you study government know that once something becomes entrenched in the government, it's there to stay, right? And these liaisons have actually become pretty good lobbyists for their own offices. And so, when I finished the book, they hadn't been getting that much federal funding, and then I went back a couple of years later, and I was like, well, what's going on now? And it turns out they had been getting not necessarily federal funding, but a lot more state money. And so while they originally weren't that successful in getting the money to do different things, that as time went on and they became part of the government structure, they were able to lobby money from different state legislators and start to build up their offices. And so over time, you actually see the amount of money post-George Bush at the state level actually go up from within state government offices. Now, I haven't done the updates on the interview, so I don't really know what they're doing now, but New Jersey's still really active, still really trying to make it interfaith, still trying to really be aware of who's going to be able to do the work and who's not. Lots of, good requirements about reporting and about, who's actually qualified to do the services. That's one more. Yeah.
Sure. Do you think these are going to have a big effect on the election that we have upcoming?
No, but I think, like I talked about before, I think this is all part of a kind of remaking of the American political system. I mean, we have a Republican Party. I mean, you go back to first slide of George Bush, this word compassion, right? Would that ever be seen in today's Republican Party? Would that whole idea of we're supposed to put this compassion in action is something that's really changed. That, he, as president, as many problems that people maybe had with him or liked him or whatever, he he changed food stamps, got a lot more people on food stamps, changed how food stamps were administered so they weren't vouchers anymore, to end the stigma of what food stamps looked like. I mean, it's funny, because people talk about Obama as a food stamp president. Food stamp president was actually George Bush. George Bush was the food stamp president, changing what food stamp, and enrolling millions of more people. But that sort of compassionate conservatism that he brought didn't continue. What continued was this idea that there is this war from government on religion, right? And, there's just last week when there was this whole discussion that God was going to be taken off of the dollar bills or American coins or, and so that, I think, is what's the lasting impact of this initiative, is that there's, it's part and parcel of a much larger social movement to change what government looks like. Whether you agree with those changes or not, I don't know, but it is a very significant change in what the American political landscape looks like right now, and it's part of that change.
So we know that American politics never stay within the confines of the United States.
Right.
Did the people you talked to have any sense of what the international, what this looked like internationally?
No, I didn't talk to them about that, but I don't know. I don't know if they were really concerned. I don't know. We didn't talk about that. I mean, this was really thinking about how this, and most of those liaisons weren't concerned about the political stuff. And in fact, I saw them almost all multiple times over these 3 years and really felt like they got ripped off. That they spent all this time and energy and effort and believed that something real was going to happen and that they were going to be able to make real change. And were so disappointed that that isn't what happened. In fact, the only one who is still a faith-based liaison is the one in New Jersey. They all quit. They all left. They were all so just fed up, saddened by what had actually really happened that they didn't want to do it anymore.
So what now? What are you working?
What now?
The book was published in 2010. What are you working on?
So part of it was doing the update to the study, looking at state laws and specifically like concrete money. Was that really changing? And then I've also been working on looking at progressive religious politics and specifically democratic political activism and why Democrats are so bad at getting religious voters. And so I've kind of been working on both those, and then also looking at various different state-level church-state laws. So whether or not states allow vouchers for religious schools, or give tax exemptions for religious schools, or allow religious monuments on properties that they consider historical, or allow pharmacists not to prescribe birth control pills based on their religious beliefs. And so we collected data from 1996 to 2009, 133 different laws across, I think, over 40 states in that 13-year period, and looked again at why states were implementing these laws that were sort of changing the boundaries of what church and state looks like. Because whether or not you agree that church-state separation is the correct conception, and everybody laughed when Sarah Palin said church-state separation is not in the Constitution. Sarah Palin's right. Church-state separation is not in the Constitution. But it has been the dominant legal principle that's governed the relationship between what religion and government should look like for over 100 years. So whether you think that that's the right conception wasn't what we were interested in. What we were interested in is why is that conception changing over time? Why are states really creating these new laws that fundamentally alter what that looks like? There was one more.
I had a question about how either you or whether it's the liaisons or anybody you encountered, when it came to the term of faith-based, what does that mean? I know you talked about it primarily being evangelicals and also this sense of whether or not it was interfaith. But what does faith-based mean in this context? Because it can be used in various capacities.
Well, that's another thing where there wasn't ever a really good definition from. So faith-based, and this for me means something that's associated with religion. So you could have a church that's inherently religious in their social service activity. So, in order to go through a drug treatment program, then you also have to be born again, right? Or it could be something so simple as, Catholic Charities homeless shelter where anyone can go. There's no religious element. Maybe they pray at night. Maybe they don't. You don't have to. It doesn't matter. It's in the basement of a church. It looks like a high school gym. There's nothing religious. seemingly about it, but it's still faith-based. And so that was sort of part of the problem, though, which, what are we trying to do here? We're already working with all of these groups that kind of look like this and giving them money. And we give some money to groups that look like this, but they have to separate it. But now all of a sudden we're saying they don't have to separate it anymore.
You mentioned political motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I think of George Bush, I think about Karl Rove being just a brilliant political strategist.
Right.
Did he mastermind this whole thing? Or?
This was, I have no idea. I mean, I think that George, I don't want to impute anybody's motives to anyone, but I did meet him once at a big faith-based conference, George Bush, not Karl Rove, and I know the work that he's doing now with AIDS in Africa. I think that he really believed in this. I think he was a believer that this was something that was really going to be a good thing. And he, this was supposed to be the cornerstone of his administration. This was supposed to be the fundamental thing that anchored him as president, that you remembered him by. And what changed that all was September 11th. And this kind of got left to the wayside. And, and maybe part of the, okay, well, we're not really going to do this actual action, but we're going to see how much